Yes.
Great. All right. So I'm going to just jump in and take us back slightly earlier in time. So today our journey will take us into the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This was the dominant power in Mesopotamia and its surrounding areas from 626 to 539 BCE. Its capital was at Babylon in what's now Iraq, and I've listed the kings here on the slide, but today we'll only be talking about Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 604 to 562. Our first stop will be the city of Uruk, marked on the map in green. This is where the Eanna temple is located. Eanna was a very ancient temple to Ishtar, the goddess of war and sex. It wasn't the most prominent temple in the empire, but it was significant and the largest in its region. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were also economically powerful institutions. Eanna, like other temples, had a storehouse where it kept its wealth, surplus, and precious materials. Money and goods were constantly going in and out of this storehouse, since Eanna was involved in many different transactions. Internally, the temple paid its priests their prebendary shares and issued materials to specialists. Eanna's cash crop was wool, which it traded within Uruk for basic staples, but personnel also traveled up to Babylon, which was a hub for more international trade. There they traded wool for silver, which was the currency at the time, and for import goods like gold and aromatics. Regionally, smaller temples nearby often relied upon Eanna for livestock and other basic goods. All of these transactions, payments, and inventories needed to be recorded, creating a lot of paperwork, well, clay work, I guess, and these records were kept in the temple's archives. So these archives have yielded between 7,000 and 8,000 inscribed clay tablets. These texts were written in Akkadian and mostly date to the Neo-Babylonian period. The bulk of them preserved economic transactions and administrative records related to the temple's activities, though there were also many archived letters between officials associated with the temple and with the government. When it comes to trying to use these archives as historical sources, we're faced with the challenge right away. These texts were meant for internal use. They were not meant to record history or even the full circumstances behind any given transaction. They're partial stories, shorthand, not meant to be saved for posterity. But all hope isn't lost for us modern scholars. There are strategies we can use to derive information about conditions in the temple, in the region, and even in the empire as a whole, if we know the kind of things we're looking for. Today we'll go through this process together, starting with a remarkable tablet from the Eanna's archive. So here it is, the text YOS 360 in all its glory, courtesy of the Yale Babylonian collection. It's a significant and unusual text. Well, actually, it's many texts. In fact, there's somewhere between 30 and 32 individual administrative texts that were copied from their originals onto this one large collected tablet. Because of the broken sections, it's hard to tell the exact number of entries. At first glance, the individual transactions are typical in their formats, but there aren't many examples of collections like this one, so it's already a bit strange. The contents of these transactions are thematically linked. The first 9 or 10 entries are related to gold, and the remaining 20 or so are about prebendary income for priests. We don't have time to discuss each transaction in detail, but for those interested, a full edition will be published in the coming weeks. But today we'll focus on the most important entries. It's worth noting that the original tablets were copied with their date formulas, which is always nice and helpful. So we have the month, day, and year for each transaction, and they are all dated to 591 to 590 BCE, which was Nebuchadnezzar II's 14th year. This should already grab our attention as a possible reason for collecting these entries together. And that is indeed our question today. Why does this collection exist? What can it tell us about what's happening in the temple and maybe the empire at large? So let's start with the gold transactions. Gold wasn't native to Mesopotamia. It was imported, mostly from Turkey, Iran, and Arabia. Eanna obtained its gold in a few different ways. Most gold was channeled into the markets in Babylon to the north, but the more expensive Naltar gold from Arabia was traded in via the sea land to the south. The king also provided gold to the temple as a gift called erbu, which might have come from conquered regions as tax, tribute, or war spoils. But why did the temples need gold anyway? It wasn't currency. Temples used gold for cultic purposes. They made jewelry and gilding for the images of the gods, as well as bowls and other implements used in rituals. Most gold transactions in the Eanna archives are allocations of small quantities to goldsmiths to create and repair these items. Only one entry in our current text had this kind of transaction though, where 3 shekels of gold were allocated for repairing jewelry and a cultic implement. This is a small quantity of gold, and it has a specific and predictable internal use in the temple. When we look at the other gold entries, something quite different is happening. Instead of using silver currency to buy gold, the temple is selling its gold and receiving silver instead. This is extremely unusual. The gold entries have a heading of sorts which reads gold, the income that was given for silver and or was dispersed. Indeed, most of the transactions that follow this heading record the amount of silver that the temple received for selling some amount of gold, while others specify that the gold or silver was sent to some other location. For example, one entry records that the temple received 10 minas of silver for 1 mina of gold. That's 60 shekels of gold, so quite a lot more than what we saw being issued for repairs. And then 2 minas of that silver were then issued to someone named Ahulomor and a decurion. Other entries state that the gold was sent directly to another location, often to Opis, an important trading post and strategic crossroad in northern Babylonia. Here at the bottom of the slide, 1 mina and 3 shekels of gold, which was sent to Opis. It may have then been sold for silver there. The gold transactions as a whole suggest that the temple was liquidating its gold inventory for cash. A total of around 9 minas of gold left its storehouse in exchange for over 57 minas of silver. This is a lot of gold and silver moving around. The dates of these entries show that there were several transactions per month. This gives the impression that the temple had a need for not only a lot of silver, but pretty quickly and consistently over the year. So where is all this gold and silver going? Why would the temple need money so badly? And what does Opis have to do with it? We'll put a pin in that for now. Before we move on to the second half of the tablet, there are 3 people mentioned in the gold transactions who are significant for our investigation. These are 3 high officials. Nabu-ahe-Idden, who is the highest temple official in Eanna, the Shatamu. Nabu-etir-napshati, the deputy or Shanu of the Sealand, and the Shakinmati or governor of the Sealand, though he's not mentioned by name. The most relevant entry in our text is this one here on the slide, 2 minas of gold as partial payment of the silver of Nabu-etir-napshati, the deputy of the Sealand, which is from the warehouse. By the order of the governor of the Sealand, the Shatamu Nabu-ahe-Idden took it to Opis. So Eanna had a silver loan from the deputy of the Sealand. They paid it back in part with gold that they withdrew from the warehouse, but instead of paying the deputy, the Shatamu was tasked with dispatching it to Opis by the deputy's boss, the governor of the Sealand. I should also mention that the Sealand governor had administrative oversight of Uruk, so Urukian officials were often at the Sealand's command. This is definitely another hint, but we'll save it for later. Let's take a look at the second half of the tablet, about 20 entries that have to do with prebendary payments. The prebend system was a core feature of the Neo-Babylonian priesthood. Priests needed the prebend, which in Akkadian is isku, which literally means share, in order to participate in the temple cult. This legal title defined the responsibilities of their service, when, for how many days, and for which gods. The largest category of prebends were for food and drink preparation, largely related to the daily ritual feeding of the gods. For instance, the priests mentioned in our text held brewer and baker prebends. Priests were issued the basic ingredients and tools that they needed to carry out their duties, and on top of that, they were compensated for their service in kind, so with staples like dates, not with money. The combined payment was usually called mashartu, but this text uses mashiku instead as a shorthand for the entire payment. But this is anyway not the strangest thing about the prebendary payments. These entries, in fact, show many problems and irregularities. First, all of the payments are only 2/3 of the share, never a full payment. That's already pretty worrying. On top of that, the priests are not paid in kind, but with substitutes. Many are given silver, either outright, such as here, 3.5 shekels of silver as partial payment for 2/3 of the mashihu, or silver in the value of the item that they were supposed to receive, like 1 shekel of silver, the price of the upper millstone. Possibly this is related to a baker's prebend, and this was meant to be the payment for 2/3 of his salary. Some of this silver might have come from the gold sales, but it seems like even that cash ran out because some priests got some other substitute payments, and these were pretty poor replacements. One priest got some firewood valued at 2 shekels of silver, and another received 2 dead sheep valued at 2.5 shekels. Now, these were probably sheep that were intended for ritual sacrifices, but they died beforehand, which means that they were no longer suitable for this purpose. So they were given as payment to this priest instead, but it really looks like scraping the bottom of the barrel here. It's not just the location of the gold and silver we have to worry about. There are signs that some of the priests are missing in action. A few entries show other people picking up the payments on behalf of the prebend holder, for instance, their sons or slaves. Other payments were delayed, sitting in the storehouse for up to a year, suggesting that the priests were away and had no one to accept it on their behalf. Where are these priests? Well, let's take stock of our hints so far. The temple needed cash and liquidated its gold inventory to get it. It nonetheless didn't have enough resources to pay its priests in full, and there are indications that several priests were absent during their prebendary days. What could be causing this? I'll suggest right away that we reject an internal crisis, since the newly liquid wealth was sent away, and there were no purchases of barley or dates from elsewhere to offset something like a famine or a poor harvest. We noted that several officials were mentioned, including the Shatamu, that is the highest temple official, and the governor and deputy of the sea land. These three often work together on state-level projects. Not only that, but as we saw, the text records that the Shatamu himself traveled to Opis, taking gold with him. So we're left with pretty strong indications that the state was responsible, that the king had ordered that his economically powerful institutions contribute money and workers for a royal initiative of some sort. There are two circumstances that usually merited this kind of pressure on temples: building projects and military campaigns. These would both explain why the temple cleared out its storehouse, why it sent its wealth elsewhere, and why some priests were absent. They would have been conscripted. We're going to evaluate these possibilities, keeping in mind that we're interested in whatever was happening in Nebuchadnezzar's 14th year, so 591 to 590 BCE. First, the possibility that Eanna was contributing to royal building projects. Several of Nebuchadnezzar's major construction works were conducted or concluded around his 14th year, and other administrative texts reveal that Eanna supported many of these projects. For instance, Eanna contributed to the construction of the North Palace in Babylon in years 18 through 29, and a text dated to Nebuchadnezzar year 13 records that it sent gold for work on Esangil, Marduk's temple in Babylon. Other contemporaneous projects included the construction of the royal canal between the Euphrates and the Tigris and the so-called Median Wall alongside it. Uruk also contributed to the Etemenanki, the ziggurat in Babylon, which was completed in Nebuchadnezzar's 14th year. But it's Opis that may be the key here. As I mentioned, Opis was an important trading post and strategic crossroad. We can rule out trading purposes. Eanna's cash crop was wool, after all, not gold. There was a long-term construction project of defensive structures in Opis, and it's very possible that resources and labor were going there for this purpose. We in fact have a number of contemporary letters between Eanna officials that show that the temple was sending not only silver and gold, but also shovels, spades, axes, bow cases, daggers, arrows, conscripted workers, and decurions to oversee them. So in general, there are many building projects, even in Opis itself, that are contemporary with the transactions in our text, making building projects a quite feasible explanation. But you might already be thinking, bows, arrows, daggers, decurions, this sounds rather more violent than what we might expect from building projects. And that takes us to our second possibility, a military campaign. Opis was also a border city with a garrison, and it acted as a collection point for military excursions. Eanna is known to have provided archers in the city for watch duties on the Tigris, hence the bows and arrows, and it would have sent over money and people to support the military forces based there. Very persuasive for a military explanation is the archival text PTS 3020, also dated to Nebuchadnezzar year 14, in which spades, shovels, axes, bow cases, daggers, and 1,200 arrows were sent to a personal guard of Eanna's Shatamu, our friend Nabu-ahe-Idin, who again traveled to deliver gold from the storehouse to Opis and then stayed. This text was dated to about 4 months later than the entry in our present text. He wrote repeatedly from there to Eanna, usually asking for dates, barley, and silver for workers' rations and wages, but in one letter he instructed the other Eanna officials to purchase bows and military equipment using the temple's silver stockpiles if necessary, and to bring lances and weapons from the storehouse. So there may have been a military reason for going to Opis. But what if Opis wasn't itself the final destination? Opis was a collection point for troops going farther afield, especially into the Levant. And indeed, a military campaign to the Levant is another possibility, specifically to Tsuru, that is modern Tyre in Lebanon, marked here on the map. Why Tyre? We know from administrative texts that the Kipu, the Eanna's royal representative, another high official, was based in Tyre at this time. For instance, the text here shows a large amount of iron, tools, and shovels being sent from Eanna to the Kipu in Tyre, with the transaction dated to the 14th year of Nebuchadnezzar, exactly contemporaneous with our text. Many letters from the Kipu to the Shatamu at this time show the Kipu consistently asking for money and resources to be sent from Eanna to Tyre. In one letter, the Kipu writes that Nabu-ahe-Idin must send him laborers, 10 talents of iron, 300 tools, and silver for wages, sternly reminding him of his obligations to the king to do so. Don't forget, he writes, you're subject to the word of the king. This further supports the fact that the state was probably involved. We know there were Babylonian garrisons there in Tyre, and these resources may have been put towards building them up, perhaps in anticipation of some military action in the region. After all, Tyre was a strategic location, both as a commercial hub and as a military strongpoint. It provided access to vast trading routes, but it was also well situated for empires with aspirations for naval dominance, especially for those kings interested in mobility between Mesopotamia and northern Africa. The Egyptian pharaohs and earlier Neo-Assyrian kings repeatedly tried to control Tyre for exactly these reasons. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed, it left a power vacuum that both Egypt and the Neo-Babylonian kings rushed to fill, starting a perennial struggle between the two over control of the Levant. Tyre had been a vassal of the Neo-Babylonian Empire as of Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, but ties weakened after a revolt in Babylonia in Nebuchadnezzar's 10th to 11th years. Why would Nebuchadnezzar suddenly care about reestablishing his dominance in the area in his 14th year in 591 to 590? Well, as it turns out, the Egyptian pharaoh, Psamtik II, went on a bit of a goodwill tour to Byblos and the Phoenician coast in 592 to 591, Nebuchadnezzar's 13th year. The exact reasons for this visit are unknown. They may have been alliance making or strengthening, or they may have been military in nature. But this visit might have prompted Nebuchadnezzar to move quickly to reestablish his presence in the area. Thus, it's probable that resources and people were rapidly funneled from Eanna and the Sealand and other temples through Opis and onward to Tyre as a crisis measure to strengthen existing garrisons, to build new military encampments, or to actually set up for campaigns in the Levant, all to protect against possible Egyptian advances. It's possible, even likely, that Nebuchadnezzar himself was in the area at this time, which would certainly be supported by the fact that the Shakinmati, Kipu Shatamu, and other high-level administrators from the Sealand and Eanna were also stationed away from their usual duties in order to oversee operations in Opis and Tyre. Such a large-scale and urgent initiative would certainly account for the pressure on the Eanna temple to provide the amounts of money, people, and resources that we see in our text. It would also explain the reason for the composition of our text as a collection of exceptional payments due to exceptional demands the king made upon the temple. If this is the case, this is actually really valuable because we otherwise have very little information from other sources about Babylonian military involvement in the Levant and tensions with Egypt. So now that we've gone through these options, I will say that in my opinion, the answer is probably a combination of factors. It's possible that the Eanna temple was already stretched thin from contributing to ongoing building projects, and it entered into a crisis mode under sudden military demands, which would explain the relatively rapid sales of assets and emptying of the storehouse. But whether you're convinced by my suggestions or not, I hope I've at least demonstrated how we work with administrative and economic archives, and in particular, how these texts can be important sources of history, even though that wasn't the point of the genre. If we look carefully at who's mentioned in them, when they were written, and what kind of transactions they record, we can start to contextualize them and piece together a larger picture of institutional, regional, and imperial affairs. Overall, I'd say that's not too shabby for what's basically a collection of very ancient receipts. Thank you.